I barely stepped out of my truck when the black Mercedes slammed into the driveway. Before I could even process what was happening, Genevieve Blackwell was standing right in front of me, holding up a notice. She looked me over with cold, dismissive eyes. "You know where you are, right?" she sneered. "This is HOA territory. Get out of here now or I'll call the cops." I didn't move. I just reached into my bag and pulled out a piece of paper. "You can call the cops, but I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice steady. "I'm Alistair Vance and you're standing on my land." She glanced at the paper in my hand, then her face froze. "This isn't your land," she scoffed. I didn't say another word. I handed her the document. She took it, opened it, and her face turned white as she read it. That was the moment I dropped the legal bomb on Genevieve. And that was the moment this war officially started. Genevieve stood there for a moment, staring at the document I'd handed her, as if she'd just been hit with a bucket of cold water. Her expression shifted from disbelief to anger in a heartbeat. She looked down at the paper, crumpling it in her perfectly manicured hand, as if it was nothing more than a nuisance. Her jaw tightened, and I could see her controlling her frustration, trying to maintain that cold, calculated exterior she wore like armor. "You think this means anything?" she snapped, tossing the crumpled paper to the ground with a flick of her wrist. "This land doesn't belong to you. It never did. The Blackwell family has controlled this place for over 20 years. Your uncle was a fool, and now you're just another one trying to mess with things you don't understand." I didn't flinch, didn't even blink. I knew her type, well, confident, arrogant, and completely unwilling to admit when they were wrong. But I also knew one thing: people like her were built on lies, and lies had a way of crumbling when faced with truth. "You're trespassing on my land, Genevieve," I said calmly, each word sharp and deliberate. "You've built your little empire here, but it's built on lies and deceit, and it's time to tear it down." Her eyes narrowed. She stepped closer, her heels digging into the gravel with a sharp, aggressive click. "I've heard enough of your delusions," she hissed. "This is private property, not some wild wilderness for you to claim. The HOA has every right to the land surrounding us. You don't belong here, and you never will." Her voice dripped with disdain, each word designed to belittle me, to push me back into my place. She was used to this, used to being the one in control. She had the board members wrapped around her finger, a small army of supporters who would do anything to keep her on top. But that was the problem. She was too comfortable, too used to getting her way. I didn't flinch, didn't show an ounce of fear. If she thought she could push me around with a few words, she had no idea what she was dealing with. "This isn't about what's yours, Genevieve," I said, keeping my tone even. "This is about what's mine, and I'm taking it back. The lakeside clubhouse, it's built on my property. The tennis courts, my land. The land your little board has been using to run your exclusive community, it's mine." She took a step back, now her confidence faltering for just a second. I saw her calculating, trying to regain her composure. She looked over at the security guard who stood silently behind her, a puppet in her hand. "You don't scare me," she finally spat, though I could hear the edge of uncertainty creeping into her voice. "You're just a man with a map trying to ruin everything I've worked for. The board won't let you get away with this." "I'm not here to scare you," I said, my voice as calm as a winter's morning. "I'm here to take back what's mine, and if I have to go through you, then that's exactly what I'll do." Her face reddened, the fury barely contained beneath her cool, polished exterior. The trap had been set, and I could feel it, the calm before the storm. This was only the beginning, and she had no idea what was coming for her. The tension between Genevieve and me escalated quickly after our first confrontation. That evening, as I sat in the quiet of my cabin, I received another letter from the HOA. This time, it wasn't a simple fine or violation notice. It was a thinly veiled threat, a demand for $500 for what they called unauthorized property maintenance due to my fence. The same fence that had been standing on my land for decades, without complaint, without incident. Apparently, now it was an eyesore that didn't meet their standards of beauty. The ridiculousness of it made my blood boil, but I knew Genevieve wasn't playing small games anymore. This was her trying to push me around, trying to bend me to her will. The next morning, I found a second letter in my mailbox. This one was even more brazen, a formal notice from the HOA informing me of a scheduled inspection of my property with the explicit request to allow access to the HOA's representatives for a complete review of my land, specifically the boundaries they claimed overlapped with mine. The nerve. She wasn't just coming after my fence now, she was trying to claim control of my entire ranch. I knew this wasn't just a checkup. It was Genevieve's way of asserting dominance, showing me she could come onto my land whenever she pleased. I wasn't about to let her walk all over me. I spent the rest of the day planning my next move. There was no way I was going to allow these people, especially Genevieve, to take control of what was rightfully mine. I needed to get ahead of this before she tried to escalate it further. That night I began going through all the historical maps, cross-referencing every single document I could find that proved the boundaries of my land. I had to be ready for whatever she was planning. The following morning, I drove into the Lakeside Estates development. I wanted to get a clearer picture of the clubhouse and the surrounding areas where Genevieve had claimed ownership. I wasn't prepared for the stark contrast between her manicured world and the wild beauty of my land. Perfectly pruned hedges lined the streets, and pristine houses were lined up in a row like a stage set from some reality show. Everything about the place screamed wealth, but it was all fake, a constructed image of success. Meanwhile, my land was raw, untouched, a living testament to the Vance family legacy. I parked near the clubhouse, eyeing the building from a distance. The white pillars and manicured lawns didn't impress me, they only made me angrier. This building, this community was built on stolen land, and I was going to make sure Genevieve understood that. Just as I was about to snap some pictures of the property line, I saw the same young security guard from before. His face twisted with recognition, and I could see the confusion in his eyes as he pulled his card up to me. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone a little more hostile than before. "Taking a few pictures," I said, keeping my tone calm and collected. "Thought I'd document a few things." He narrowed his eyes as if trying to decide if I was a real threat or just a nuisance. "You can't be here. This is HOA property. I'll have to report you." I glanced at him unimpressed. "Go ahead. Tell Genevieve I'm here. Maybe she'll want to come down and chat herself." The guard hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. He muttered something under his breath, got back in his cart, and drove off without another word. I smiled to myself. Genevieve was used to running the show, but she wasn't prepared for me. Not this time. Not when I was armed with the truth. As I left the development, I knew things were about to get uglier. But I was ready. I wasn't backing down. Not for her, not for anyone. This was only the beginning, and I was going to make sure Genevieve understood exactly who was in charge now. By the time Genevieve and her team sent their representatives to inspect my property, I'd gathered enough evidence to make their claims look like the ridiculous farce they were. My legal team, Julian Reed and I, had been preparing for the worst. I knew Genevieve would pull every trick in the book to intimidate me, and I was ready to counter her moves with hard facts. The day of the inspection, I arrived at the property early, determined to observe every move the HOA made. Sure enough, by late morning, two well-dressed individuals arrived in a sleek black SUV with the HOA's logo stamped on the side. A man and a woman, both in their 30s, stepped out, their faces impassive, as they carried clipboards and took exaggerated notes, as if to imply they were official inspectors. I stood at the edge of my property, waiting for them to approach. When they finally saw me, the man gave a curt nod, but the woman just rolled her eyes. It was clear they were there to assert authority to make me feel small. "Mr. Vance, we're here to check on the condition of your property," the man said clearly, reading from a script. "This is a routine inspection for all homes within the HOA boundary, and it's necessary for us to ensure that everything is up to code." I raised an eyebrow, making sure they saw my skepticism. "This land is not part of the HOA's jurisdiction," I said, keeping my tone firm. "The only thing you're inspecting today is your illegal encroachment." The woman scoffed, glancing at her clipboard. "Mr. Vance, the HOA's property lines extend within a 1-mile radius of the clubhouse, and that includes your land. We have a right to inspect for aesthetic standards, maintenance, and safety." I could feel the frustration rising in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. "Your property lines are based on fraudulent documents. Your so-called inspection is a sham." The woman glanced at her colleague, who looked just as uncomfortable as I felt, but he quickly recovered and stepped forward. "You're mistaken," he said, holding up a map. "We have a legal right to these lands. It's all here in the master deed." "No, it's not," I snapped. "Look at this." I reached into my bag, pulling out a copy of the 1965 survey map. This map shows the true property lines. "The land you're standing on," I gestured to the large swath of land where they were standing, "is mine. All of it. No easement, no agreement. You've been stealing from my family for years." They both looked at the map, their eyes widening slightly. The woman opened her mouth to argue, but the man cut her off. "We need to verify this. We can't just take your word for it. We'll need to get confirmation from the board." I shook my head, my patience wearing thin. "You do that. But while you're at it, you might want to check your own board's financial records. I'm sure Genevieve Blackwell would love to explain why the HOA's money was funneled into a shell company her brother runs." The mention of the shell company hit home. They both stiffened, and I could see the panic starting to creep into their expressions. The man quickly turned to his colleague, murmuring something under his breath. She wasn't looking at me anymore. Her eyes darted to the car, then back to the clipboard. It was clear they were rattled. The facade of authority was crumbling, and they knew they were standing on shaky ground. Before they could respond, I took a step back and pulled out my phone. "I'm calling Julian. We'll see how long your inspection lasts once the legal team gets involved." The woman immediately tried to make an excuse, but I was already dialing. I watched as the two of them glanced at each other, and their faces sank. They were no longer the confident HOA representatives. They were just two people caught in a web of lies. I wasn't just protecting my land anymore. This was about showing them that I wasn't the same vulnerable heir they thought they could walk all over. I was going to make them pay for every step they took on my land. "I'd suggest you leave," I said, watching them closely, "before things get any worse for you." They didn't need any more encouragement. The woman shot one last look at me, then turned and walked back to the car. The man hesitated, then followed, casting me a long, uncomfortable look. By the time they pulled away, I knew I had them rattled. This was just the beginning, and Genevieve wouldn't be able to hide behind her lies for much longer. The HOA was about to get exposed for what it really was, a corrupt, greedy organization built on stolen land, and I was going to make sure everyone knew it. The days following Genevieve's attempted inspection passed in a blur of legal papers, drone surveys, and hours of documentation. But despite all the progress, something in the pit of my stomach told me this was far from over. Genevieve wasn't going to sit idly by while I exposed her scheme. I had a feeling she would come back stronger, more desperate, and I was ready for whatever she threw my way. Then, one fateful afternoon, I received a call from Julian Reed that would change everything. He sounded serious, more serious than usual, and I could hear the concern in his voice as he spoke. "Alistair, I've uncovered something big." I sat up straighter, bracing myself. "What's going on?" Julian paused for a moment before continuing, his voice low. "The contractor who worked on the clubhouse and the surrounding development, he made some major alterations to the boundary lines back in 1998. I've got the paperwork, the records, and even the contractor's bank statements. Genevieve Blackwell wasn't just building on your land, Alistair. She actively manipulated the boundaries, and it all started with forged documents. Her predecessor signed off on it, but Genevieve was the one who allowed it to continue." I leaned back in my chair, my heart pounding. For a moment, I couldn't find my words. "So, you're telling me this wasn't just an innocent mistake, this was planned? For decades?" Julian didn't hesitate. "Exactly. They didn't just cross a line, they bulldozed over it. They altered the original survey map, forged the deed, and presented it to the county like it was gospel. The entire Lakeside Estates development, clubhouse, tennis courts, and all was built on your land, legally speaking." I sat there, letting the weight of his words settle in. The clubhouse, the luxurious tennis courts, the sprawling estate, all sitting on land that wasn't theirs. That didn't just feel like a violation, it was theft. Cold, calculated theft. But that wasn't the worst part. "We found more," Julian continued. "Not just the forged documents. The contractor didn't stop with the boundary lines. In fact, they diverted water from the lake for the irrigation system of the development. It's not just a property violation now, it's an environmental disaster." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "What do you mean an environmental disaster?" Genevieve and the HOA allowed the runoff from the irrigation system to spill directly into protected wetlands on your land, Julian explained. "The chemicals from their landscaping have poisoned the water, killing fish and wildlife. It's a serious violation of state and federal law. If the environmental regulators get involved, they could fine them $50, 000 a day, for every day the contamination continues." The reality of it all sank in. This was no longer a simple land dispute over a few feet of boundary line. This was a systemic violation of everything that mattered. Genevieve and the HOA had not only been stealing land, they had been recklessly damaging the environment, harming wildlife, and creating an ecological mess that could take years, if not decades, to fix. I knew this wasn't just about property rights anymore. This was bigger. Much bigger. I spent the next few days meticulously reviewing everything Julian had sent me. The original 1,965 survey map, the altered deeds, the contractor's records. Every piece of evidence fit together like a puzzle, revealing the true scope of Genevieve's manipulations. This wasn't just about one development, it was a 20-year-long scheme of fraud, deception, and greed. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. Genevieve Blackwell wasn't just running an HOA. She had built an empire on a lie. My mind raced as I considered my options. I could take them to court, but that would take time, and I needed to act fast. Genevieve's empire was built on her ability to control the narrative. If I didn't expose her now, she could twist the story in her favor, burying the truth behind a wall of lies. The last thing I wanted was to drag this out into a protracted battle. I needed to make sure that the public, the residents of Lakeside Estates, saw the truth, and saw it quickly. I immediately reached out to a top-tier environmental consultant, someone who specialized in these kinds of violations. I needed an expert who could document the contamination and provide evidence that Genevieve's HOA had been running an illegal operation under the radar for years. I also contacted the district attorney's office, making sure they were aware of the potential criminal charges Genevieve and her team could face once everything came to light. But I wasn't done yet. I knew Genevieve's weakness, and it wasn't just her greed. It was her need to control everything. She had positioned herself as the queen of Lakeside Estates, the woman who could bend the rules to suit her desires. And while she thought she could control the HOA board and the residents of the community, there was one thing she hadn't counted on: the truth. With Julian's help, I began building a case against Genevieve that was airtight. The altered deeds, the forged signatures, the environmental damage. Every piece of the puzzle fell into place, and soon I had a file thick enough to bury her in legal paperwork. But I knew the HOA wasn't going to roll over easily. Genevieve wouldn't let her carefully constructed kingdom collapse without a fight. She would do everything in her power to defend her position, no matter the cost. As I sat in the cabin one evening, reviewing the evidence one last time, I knew I couldn't afford to let up. The fight had just begun, and Genevieve wasn't going to back down. But I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not this time. The more I thought about the damage she had caused, both to my land and to the environment, the angrier I became. She had crossed the line, and now she was going to pay. The next morning, I contacted the state's Environmental Protection Agency. I made sure they had everything they needed to investigate the runoff and the contamination. I also sent a formal letter to the HOA board, informing them that I was prepared to take legal action for both the property violations and the environmental damage. The stage was set. Genevieve thought she had control, but in reality, she was standing on a foundation of lies that was about to crumble. The next move was hers, but I knew she wouldn't be able to stop the avalanche I was about to unleash. I had the law on my side, and I wasn't about to let her walk away from this mess unscathed. The real fight had begun. The following days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and legal preparations. I had contacted every authority I could think of, and I wasn't about to back down. Genevieve Blackwell might have thought she could control the narrative with her HOA board and her shiny clubhouse, but she was about to realize that her empire was built on a foundation of fraud, and it was collapsing. The first breakthrough came when the state's Environmental Protection Agency, armed with the report from my environmental consultant, arrived at the property to begin their investigation. It didn't take them long to confirm what we already knew. The irrigation runoff from the Lakeside Estates development was in fact contaminating the wetlands. The tests came back showing elevated levels of harmful chemicals, including fertilizers and pesticides that were leaching into the water supply. The damage was severe, far worse than anyone had expected. They confirmed that the contamination could lead to catastrophic ecological consequences if left unchecked. I wasn't surprised, but the real bombshell came later that day when I received a call from the county sheriff's office. Sheriff Robert Thorne, a man who had always been professional but a bit distant in the past, was on the line. His voice was calm but serious. "Alistair, I've been made aware of the situation with Genevieve and the HOA," Sheriff Thorne said. "I've looked into the matter, and based on the environmental findings, we've got enough to initiate an investigation on the criminal side of things. I'm sending a team down to collect evidence and make sure we get the proper paperwork in order. This isn't just a civil matter anymore, it's criminal." My heart raced, but I kept my voice steady. "So this is going beyond the property disputes. This is about criminal charges." "That's right," Thorne replied. "Environmental violations are serious. And based on the documents you've provided about the forged deeds and the illegal alterations to the property lines, we're looking at charges for fraud, environmental damage, and possibly more." Genevieve and her board members are in a lot of trouble. It was surreal to hear those words, knowing that everything I had worked for, the careful preparation, the endless hours of research, was finally paying off. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. I had to make sure this didn't just fizzle out like so many other disputes did. I had to make sure Genevieve faced the consequences of her actions, no matter how hard she fought back. Later that week I received another call, this time from the district attorney's office. The evidence I had provided, including the forged documents and the environmental reports, was enough to push them into action. They had begun preparing a case against Genevieve and the HOA board, and they were moving quickly. A formal investigation was underway, and subpoenas were being issued to retrieve financial records, correspondence, and any documents related to the construction of Lakeside Estates and its subsequent violations. The pressure was building, but I knew it wasn't over yet. Genevieve would fight this tooth and nail. She had her connections, her influence, and a history of using her position to intimidate and manipulate. But this time, it wasn't going to work. She couldn't control the facts, and she couldn't control the law. As the investigation grew in scope, more of the HOA's dirty secrets began to surface. Martha Higgins, the board treasurer, who had been quietly speaking to me about Genevieve's shady dealings, stepped forward as a whistleblower. She was nervous but resolute, as she provided further documentation about the misappropriation of HOA funds. She confirmed that Genevieve had funneled thousands of dollars into the shell company tied to her brother. The money that was supposed to go toward community improvements, maintenance, and legal fees had instead been used to line the pockets of the Blackwell family. Martha's testimony was the final piece of the puzzle. With it, the case against Genevieve was all but sealed. By the time the sheriff's office arrived at the Lakeside Estates clubhouse with a warrant for Genevieve's arrest, the entire community had begun to stir. The HOA board was in disarray, scrambling to cover their tracks and distance themselves from Genevieve's criminal actions. The residents once so loyal to her were starting to question everything. The revelations were too much to ignore, and the tide was turning. Sheriff Thorne and his team moved in quietly, but it was clear this was going to be anything but a quiet resolution. Genevieve had built her empire with lies, but now the truth was coming to light, and it was going to destroy everything she had worked for. I stood on the porch of my cabin, watching as the sheriff's deputies arrived at the Lakeside Estates entrance, their sirens flashing in the distance. The last piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. The community that had been manipulated for so long was finally seeing the truth, and Genevieve Blackwell's reign of terror was coming to an end. The investigation was far from over, but Genevieve's downfall was imminent. She had underestimated me. She had underestimated the power of the law, and she had certainly underestimated the resolve of a man who was protecting what was rightfully his. And as the sheriff's team moved into the heart of Lakeside Estates, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was more than just a victory for me, it was a victory for everyone who had ever been pushed around by someone like Genevieve. It was a reminder that no one is above the law. The following morning, I could sense the seismic shift in the air. It wasn't just the physical presence of the sheriff's department at Lakeside Estates, it was the collective realization that Genevieve's carefully constructed empire was crumbling. The first wave of legal papers had already been served to her, and there was no turning back now. What had once been a whisper of doubt among a few residents was now a roaring tide of uncertainty, with the HOA board members themselves beginning to question their involvement. I stood on the porch of my cabin watching the sheriff's car parked at the entrance to the gated community. It wasn't just a car, this was the tip of the spear, the calm before the storm. Genevieve Blackwell's world was about to be torn apart piece by piece, and I wasn't about to let her slip through the cracks. She had run this community with an iron fist for far too long, manipulating the board, coercing the residents, and using her wealth and influence to stay untouchable. But the law was different. It was something she couldn't control, with threats or charm. I wasn't going to wait for her to strike back. I was taking the next step. My lawyer, Julian Reed, had filed the formal request for an injunction aimed at halting all construction on my property and forcing Genevieve's HOA to remove the illegally placed structures and pay restitution. But I wasn't content with simply winning in court. I wanted the whole community to see what Genevieve had done. As I drove toward the Lakeside Estates clubhouse, the contrast between the community's manicured lawns and my rugged, untouched land seemed even starker. The lush green lawns, the pristine tennis courts, and the expensive homes now stood as monuments to Genevieve's corruption. This wasn't just about land ownership anymore. This was about accountability. Genevieve's manipulation wasn't just personal. It had hurt the entire community by diverting funds, using residents' money for her own gain, and poisoning the environment for the sake of her vision of perfection. When I reached the gates, I was greeted by more than just the security guard who had tried to stop me days earlier. This time, there was a small crowd gathering. Curious faces peered out from behind the hedges and windows. The word had spread and the residents knew something was happening. I wasn't alone in this fight anymore. People who had been silent, who had been swept up in Genevieve's charm and promises, were beginning to see the truth. I parked my truck and walked toward the gates, my steps steady, purposeful. As I approached the security booth, I could see the guard from before hesitate before standing up straighter. He didn't know whether to stop me or let me pass, but one look at my expression told him all he needed to know. This wasn't a confrontation, it was the beginning of the end. "You can't go any further," he said, raising his hand in protest. "Mrs. Blackwell's been warned." I didn't flinch. "Get her. Now." He hesitated but picked up the radio, muttering into it, probably trying to summon backup. Moments later, the sound of a black Mercedes pulling into the lot made my stomach turn. Genevieve's personal vehicle, her throne on wheels. She didn't exit in a rush, though. Instead, she strolled out slowly, adjusting her sunglasses, clearly trying to maintain an air of control. She wasn't ready for the truth, though, and she certainly wasn't prepared for me to be standing there, evidence in hand. Mr. Vance, Genevieve's voice dripped with that all-too-familiar condescension. "What is it you think you're doing?" I stepped forward, holding up the folder filled with all the evidence, the forged deeds, the altered property lines, the environmental violations, and the financial records showing how her shell company had funneled money right out of the HOA's pockets. "This is what I think I'm doing," I said, sliding the papers into her hands before she could even process. "And you've got a lot to answer for, Mrs. Blackwell. Not just to me, but to every person you've swindled and every resident you've manipulated." Genevieve's face turned pale as she flipped through the pages, but it wasn't just shock on her face. It was realization, the cold, hard knowledge that her carefully crafted world was unraveling right before her eyes. "What do you think you're going to accomplish with this?" she spat, trying to regain some semblance of composure, but her voice wavered. "I'm going to make sure the world knows what you did," I said, my voice low and controlled. "And that starts with you and the HOA board being held accountable for every cent you stole and every person you manipulated." Before she could retort, I heard the unmistakable hum of a helicopter overhead. It wasn't just any helicopter, it was the sheriff's department's chopper, arriving to assist with the operation. Behind me, a fleet of law enforcement vehicles pulled into the entrance, and the residents began to gather, watching in a mix of awe, confusion, and fear. The final pieces of the puzzle were coming into place. The sheriff's team descended swiftly and efficiently, moving to surround the clubhouse. Genevieve stood frozen, her sunglasses now discarded, her air of authority shattered. The rest of the HOA board members who had been in the meeting scrambled out of the clubhouse, their eyes darting nervously. They could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. The sheriff's deputies approached Genevieve, handcuffing her as the residents looked on. The man who had once been her loyal enforcer, someone who had protected her every move, looked around, unsure of what to do. He had no power now. It was over. "You're under arrest," Sheriff Thorne said, his voice firm. "For fraud, conspiracy, and environmental damage, you have the right to remain silent." As they led Genevieve away, the community stood still, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. The truth had come out, and there was no turning back. The era of Genevieve Blackwell's manipulation was over. The residents, once blinded by loyalty or fear, were now free to see what had been happening under their noses. They could see the lies, the theft, the ecological damage, and they knew who had brought it to light. I watched as the sheriff's deputies drove Genevieve away, her face a mask of pure disbelief. For the first time, she wasn't in control. The truth had finally caught up with her, and the community she had dominated was about to experience its own reckoning. It was over. The air inside Lakeside Estates clubhouse was thick with tension. The once sturdy walls that had been Genevieve Blackwell's fortress of control now felt fragile. Residents whispered in confusion as I stepped into the room, my presence disrupting the calm facade that Genevieve had carefully maintained for years. Today wasn't just another HOA meeting, it was the moment the truth would be revealed. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs, "you've heard the rumors. The sheriff is here. Genevieve Blackwell is under arrest. But that's not all. There's much more to this story." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on me. I knew this was the moment to make them see the truth they had been blind to for so long. What Genevieve and the HOA board did wasn't just a mistake. It was a deliberate act of fraud. For years they'd been sitting on stolen land, my land. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some of the residents shifted uncomfortably, others sat stunned as they processed what I was saying. But I wasn't done yet. They manipulated the property lines, forged documents, and used your money to build a luxury development on my land, I continued. And it gets worse. The irrigation runoff has poisoned our wetlands. Chemicals are leaching into the water. This isn't just a property dispute, it's an environmental disaster. I could feel the room shift as the reality hit. Genevieve had lied to everyone, and now the truth was being laid bare. The residents who had trusted her, who had followed her lead, were starting to see just how deep the corruption ran. "I'm not here to just expose her actions," I said, my voice gaining strength. I'm here to make sure we hold her accountable. We can't let her get away with this." The door to the clubhouse swung open, and Genevieve entered, her usual air of confidence faltering as she saw the gathered crowd. The smirk on her face didn't last long. She tried to step forward, but I cut her off. "You're done, Genevieve," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You've stolen from this community, and now the truth is out." Genevieve's face twisted with disbelief as law enforcement moved toward her. She tried to speak to defend herself, but no words came. The sheriff stepped forward, and Genevieve's reign came to an abrupt end. "Genevieve Blackwell," the sheriff said, "you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and environmental damage." As she was led away, the room was still. The residents were finally free of her influence, and for the first time they saw the truth they had been kept from for so long. The quiet buzz of disbelief that followed Genevieve's arrest was palpable, but it was nothing compared to the storm that was about to hit. The residents of Lakeside Estates had just seen their so-called leader fall, but they still needed to see the proof that Genevieve's control over them had been built on lies and deceit. That's where I came in. The sheriff's deputies had begun to secure the clubhouse, and I knew this was my moment to ensure the truth wasn't lost in the chaos. The room was still filled with the stunned residents, and as Genevieve was escorted away, I stepped forward once more, this time with a stack of documents in my hand, a stack that would change everything. "Now that Genevieve's gone, I began. It's time to show you what she was hiding. I've got the proof. The very documents she thought would never be uncovered." I laid the papers down on the table in front of me, each one representing a piece of the puzzle that Genevieve had spent years carefully assembling. The first document was a copy of the original 1965 survey map, the one Genevieve and her contractors had altered to make it appear as though the land she had developed was rightfully hers. I watched as the residents leaned forward, some squinting to read the fine print, while others waited for the next piece of the puzzle. This map, I continued pointing to the lines that had been redrawn, was the basis for everything. Genevieve's entire development was built on these forged documents. The land she claimed as hers, this, I pointed to the map again, was always mine. The Lakeside Estates clubhouse, the tennis courts, the entire development, none of it was legally hers. The murmurs started again, louder this time. I could feel the disbelief turning into outrage. Genevieve had built her empire by exploiting these people's trust and using the HOA as a tool to further her agenda. But now they had seen the evidence. I pushed forward, showing them the next set of documents, bank statements, financial records, and emails detailing the illegal transactions between Genevieve and the shell company that had been funneled funds under the guise of environmental maintenance. These weren't just mismanaged funds, they were stolen. Genevieve had used her position to siphon off HOA funds and funnel them into her own pockets and those of her associates. "This," I said, "is the money you've all been paying in your dues for the last 20 years. The money that was supposed to go toward community improvements and maintaining this property, it went straight into her brother's shell company, BEM, Environmental Services. And they did nothing. Absolutely nothing." I paused to let the magnitude of the situation sink in. The residents had believed they were contributing to a community that upheld high standards, but they had been manipulated into paying for Genevieve's luxury lifestyle. The final blow came with the environmental violations. I presented the state inspection reports, which confirmed that the irrigation runoff from the development had been leaking toxic chemicals into the wetlands for years. The state had even issued a warning for potential federal fines, amounting to $50,000 per day for each day the contamination had been ongoing. Genevieve's actions weren't just illegal, they were dangerous. The room was completely silent now. No one was speaking, no one was questioning. The truth had been laid out in black and white, and there was no denying it anymore. "This is just the beginning," I said, my voice resolute. "This isn't just about Genevieve and the HOA. This is about all of us coming together to restore what's been broken, to make sure that something like this never happens again." I could see the change in the room. Eyes that had once been filled with skepticism were now wide with shock and understanding. People were beginning to connect the dots, and the realization that they too had been victims of Genevieve's manipulation was starting to hit. But there was no turning back now. The truth had been exposed. Genevieve's reign of control was over, and the residents of Lakeside Estates were ready to fight back. The room had been plunged into an uncomfortable silence after the last of the evidence had been shown. The weight of what had just been revealed began to fully settle over the residents of Lakeside Estates. What they had once believed to be an idyllic, well-run community was now exposed for what it truly was, a web of deception and manipulation all tied to one woman's insatiable desire for control. And in the wake of Genevieve's arrest, the cracks in her empire deepened. As the deputies continued their work, the room began to stir. The once loyal followers of Genevieve were no longer standing by her side. The truth was undeniable now. No one could ignore the financial mismanagement, the environmental violations, or the decades of lies. The realization that they had been complicit in her scheme was slowly taking root. There was no turning back from this point. But what happened next was even more telling. Genevieve, who had once been the untouchable leader who had commanded such respect, was now being led through the door in handcuffs. The sheriff's deputies moved with calm efficiency, not only arresting her, but ensuring that the entire community understood the full extent of her crimes. It wasn't just Genevieve who would suffer the consequences. The entire HOA board was now under intense scrutiny. Their decisions, their actions, and their blind loyalty to a woman who had betrayed them all were being laid bare. As the crowd began to react to her arrest, I could see the community's feelings shift from shock to anger. People began to speak, their voices rising in collective outrage, demanding answers for the years they had spent under Genevieve's thumb. I let them speak. They had every right to be furious. It was clear they felt betrayed by her, but more so by themselves for having not seen the signs earlier. The first to speak up was Martha Higgins, the former treasurer who had become my ally after stepping forward as a whistleblower. She stood up slowly, her face a mix of regret and resolve. She had been a part of the system that Genevieve had created, but she had also helped bring it down. And now she had the courage to speak the truth. I never knew. Martha began, her voice shaky, but growing steadier with every word. I was just doing my job, following the rules, thinking everything was fine. But when I started to see the discrepancies, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't be part of this anymore. Her words resonated with the crowd. People who had been so quick to defend Genevieve were now questioning their own roles in her reign of control. They began to realize that the facade of perfection they had once seen was nothing more than a mask hiding a criminal enterprise. Martha took a deep breath before continuing. We were manipulated just like everyone else. I should have known better. I'm sorry for not speaking up sooner. Her admission was the first step in healing, not just for her, but for the entire community. The residents needed to hear this. They needed to understand that they weren't alone in their failure to see the truth. They had been blinded by Genevieve's charm and the comfort of their privileged lives. Now they had to confront the consequences. The room began to settle as more people stood up, each person slowly coming to terms with their part in the situation. The true nature of the HOA's corruption had been exposed. But what came next was just as important, the process of redemption, of rebuilding. I spoke up again, my voice firm and steady. Genevieve's empire is crumbling, and this community needs to rebuild from the ground up. It's not enough to simply remove her from power. We need to restore what's been lost: trust, integrity, and respect for the land. The room nodded in agreement. It was clear now that the residents weren't just looking for justice, they were looking for a way forward. And that meant taking ownership of their collective mistakes, acknowledging the damage caused by Genevieve's actions, and committing to a new vision for Lakeside Estates, one based on honesty, fairness, and accountability. As Genevieve was driven away in the back of a patrol car, her legacy was left in ruins. But the community had a choice. They could rebuild, learn from their mistakes, and forge a future that honored the land and each other. The battle for control of the land had been won, but the real challenge would be creating a community that would never let something like this happen again. The foundation had been laid for a new beginning, and it started with the truth. The truth had been set free, and it was the most powerful weapon in this fight. Genevieve Blackwell had been defeated, and with her, the corrupt system she had built. The residents of Lakeside Estates had a long road ahead, but they had taken the first step together. The weeks following Genevieve's arrest were a whirlwind of legal battles, community meetings, and environmental restoration. As the dust settled, the once perfect facade of Lakeside Estates crumbled, revealing a group of residents struggling to understand how they had been so easily deceived for so long. But what I witnessed in those first few days after the reveal was the quiet shift, the beginning of healing. The air around the community seemed to change. What had once been a tense, exclusive neighborhood under Genevieve's thumb was now filled with open conversations, a mix of regret, frustration, and surprisingly hope. As more residents came forward to apologize for their roles in allowing the system to continue, I realized just how many had been unknowingly complicit. They had trusted the wrong person, but now they were ready to rebuild together, to learn from their mistakes and make the necessary changes. Martha Higgins, once a hesitant figure on the board, emerged as a strong voice for change. She became a kind of anchor for the community. Her courage to speak out had been a catalyst for many others to step forward, and, with each apology and each act of accountability, the bonds between the residents began to heal. What Genevieve did to us was wrong. Martha spoke at a community meeting, her voice steady but filled with conviction. But what we do from here, how we take responsibility for our actions, is what will define us as a community. It's time to move forward. Together. That night, as I walked the perimeter of the ranch, I saw people working together on small projects, repairing fences, cleaning up the shared spaces. They were taking ownership of their surroundings, both the beauty and the damage caused. It was symbolic. The land was healing, and so were they. The residents who had once feared Genevieve's power now stood united in a common goal to restore the integrity of the land and the community. But while the emotional healing had begun, the legal and financial work was far from over. Genevieve's downfall had been swift, but the consequences of her actions rippled far beyond her arrest. The legal teams, both for the district attorney's office and the residents, worked tirelessly to ensure that the full scope of her crimes would be addressed. The investigation into her financial dealings, including the shell company, BEM Environmental Services, revealed more than we had ever imagined. The amount of embezzlement was staggering. Over $250,000 had been siphoned off into her personal accounts, hidden behind layers of fraudulent environmental contracts. But the true damage lay in the environmental violations. Genevieve's actions had not only stolen from the residents, but had also caused irreparable harm to the ecosystem surrounding the ranch and the development. As the investigations continued, Genevieve's accomplices, those who had blindly followed her or been swayed by her influence, began to face legal repercussions as well. Board members who had signed off on fraudulent documents found themselves facing charges of negligence and conspiracy. The entire HOA board was dismantled, and a court-appointed receiver took over the responsibilities of the association. The justice was slow but methodical. A series of court hearings saw Genevieve convicted on charges of embezzlement, conspiracy, and environmental negligence. Her personal assets, including the luxury cars and expensive properties, were seized and liquidated to pay the restitution. In the end, Genevieve was sentenced to 5 years in prison, a fitting punishment for the havoc she had caused. As the court proceedings drew to a close, the residents of Lakeside Estates finally found some semblance of closure. It wasn't just about the criminal charges, it was about knowing that the system they had trusted had finally been restored to its rightful order. The legal consequences were a harsh but necessary step to ensure that no one could exploit the community in the same way again. As winter approached, the transformation of Lakeside Estates was almost complete. The community, once a model of controlled perfection, was now a model of restoration. The environmental damages caused by Genevieve's illegal irrigation runoff were reversed. The wetlands that had been poisoned were carefully restored, and the original beauty of the landscape was returning slowly but surely. The homes that had been built on stolen land were no longer just symbols of greed. They were part of a new community, one that had learned from its mistakes. The HOA had been restructured this time, with an emphasis on transparency and accountability. The new board was made up of residents who truly cared about the future of Lakeside Estates, and they worked hand in hand with environmental experts to ensure that the land would be preserved for generations to come. The final piece of the transformation was the removal of the clubhouse extension. Genevieve's pride and joy had sat on land that wasn't hers, but it had also been a symbol of the entitlement that had poisoned the community. Its removal was more than just a legal victory, it was a symbolic gesture of the community's return to its roots. As the last remnants of the clubhouse were dismantled, the residents gathered together to watch the work being done. There was a sense of unity in the air, a collective understanding that what they were witnessing was more than just construction. It was the reclaiming of their community. The land once so heavily contested was now theirs in every sense of the word. I stood off to the side watching the community celebrate its rebirth. The legacy of the Vance Ranch, which had been nearly erased by Genevieve's greed, was now safe not just for me, but for everyone who had been affected by her actions. The land would continue to thrive, and the people who lived on it would ensure that it stayed that way. As I walked back to the cabin, the sound of the work crews and the laughter of the residents behind me, I knew that this was where I was meant to be. The war had been long, but the peace that followed was worth every battle fought. The truth had set us free, and now Lakeside Estates had a future, one that would be built on respect, trust, and the preservation of what truly mattered. The end of one era and the beginning of another. A new chapter had begun. Looking back, the win wasn't what mattered most. It was how things unfolded, and how the law, not emotion, drove the final outcome. If I had let anger take the lead or rushed to confront Genevieve in an emotional outburst, it would have been a different story. Instead, I chose to follow the proper channels, letting the legal process guide me. That patience and respect for the system made all the difference. It wasn't about revenge. It was about exposing the truth, letting the evidence speak for itself. Standing up for yourself or your rights doesn't mean giving in to emotions or taking matters into your own hands. Legal escalation is about measured steps, gathering facts, consulting professionals, and trusting the system to bring justice. Violence or impulsive actions only cloud the real issue and derail the process. By focusing on the evidence, we made sure that the right course of action prevailed. To anyone in a similar situation, take it slow. Keep thorough records of everything. When in doubt, look up public filings. You don't always need to act immediately. Knowing when to involve the right people can make all the difference. When you approach things from a place of calm, the path forward becomes clear. Communities are strongest when people respect the law, and when the power of an HOA or any system isn't allowed to go unchecked. The land I fought for, with its unbroken boundary and restored peace, now stands as a reminder of what can happen when justice is allowed to take its course. It was never just about reclaiming property. It was about protecting the integrity of something bigger.